The Process Podcast, breaking down the daily habits, processes, and tools of high achievers. Now, here's your host, Brad Wilson.
Well, hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to The Process Podcast. Today's guest is Scott Eblin. Scott's an executive business and leadership coach who's worked with organizations like FedEx, Capital One, GE, Gap, Kaiser Permanente, and many others. He's a Harvard graduate and the best-selling author of Overworked and Overwhelmed, The Mindfulness Alternative. He's also written for publications like Entrepreneur.com, Fast Company, and the Huffington Post. I feel so grateful to have had this opportunity to speak with Scott. And when our call ended, I was able to reflect back on our conversation. I came to realize that no matter what obstacles we face throughout our lives, if we're able to maintain a positive perspective and dig deep within ourselves with grit and determination, we're capable of overcoming anything. In today's show, Scott discusses how integrating a regular yoga practice helped change his life after he was diagnosed with MS, his wife's vital role in surviving post-diagnosis, brain chemicals, why we can't help but check our email 10,000 times per day, and a priceless life lesson Scott shares about being vulnerable. So without any further ado, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Hey Scott, how are you? Welcome to the show.
Hey Brad, happy to be here. Took us a while to connect, but I'm glad we did.
Yeah, technical difficulties, just the nature of the beast in the world that we live in.
It is.
So, in your book, Overworked and Overwhelmed, you talked about performance equals potential minus interference.
Yeah.
So, first of all, how do you define interference?
Well, the first thing I want to do is give credit where it's due to a really excellent leadership coach who's been around a long time named Tim Gallwey. And he's the guy that came up with that. He started out in life as a tennis coach in California in the 1970s. And he realized that a lot of people were not good tennis players because their brain was getting in the way of their body, right? Mm-hmm. And they were too focused on all the little things, like how do you position your feet and how do you bring the racket back and so forth. And so he's the guy that came up with the equation: your performance equals your potential minus your interference. And building on Tim's work, my definition of interference, to use the vernacular, is it's your itty bitty shitty committee. Basically, it's that little voice inside your head that says, oh, wow, this really sucks, or wow, I'm not good enough to do this, or how did I ever get here? Like, I'm so unqualified for this, or whatever, right?
Right.
And so, or these people really annoy me and they make me angry, or whatever it is. And so, interference, and this is another little add-on I have to Tim's work. Interference, I think, comes in two flavors. One flavor is extrinsic interference, and the other is intrinsic interference. Extrinsic is all that stuff out there in the world that triggers you. It could be your overflowing email inbox. It could be the 10 meetings that you have to do on any given day at work, and how am I going to get through all this stuff, or your to-do list that's really long and like, oh my gosh, I can't do all that. What am I ever going to do? Or screaming kids, or breaking news on TV that, you find really annoying, whatever it is.
Words with friends, notifications.
Yeah, exactly. Any of that. And so that triggers the intrinsic interference, which, like for me, is that itty bitty committee. And the whole idea is if we could get rid of the interference, then our performance would just straight up equal our potential. And that's really where I'm trying to help my clients get is, one is to really understand what their triggers are, and what the typical script is that runs in their head when they're triggered. And if they can recognize that, then you're much more likely to be able to direct your thought process to something more productive, right? If I don't recognize the interference and I just let it run, then really nothing good is going to result from that.
which is where mindfulness comes into play.
Yeah. And so with mindfulness, I don't consider myself a mindfulness guru or anything, but I think I try to make things simple for people and my clients, especially, and readers. And so for me, mindfulness is really just the combination of two things. It's awareness of both extrinsically and intrinsically what's going on around me and what's going on inside of me, physically, mentally, emotionally, in response or reaction to what's going on around me. And then the second part of mindfulness is just awareness, and it's intention is the second part. And, it's being intentional about what I'm going to do, or maybe more importantly, sometimes not going to do next. So, mindfulness for me just equals awareness plus intention.
Do you find that more people get interference from physical things or emotional things?
That's an interesting question. Interference from physical or emotional things. I think, with the triggers, I guess most of the triggers, are physical. I hadn't really thought about it that way. I think, the physical and emotional aspect of it for me comes more in terms of the intrinsic interference, like what's my reaction or response to the extrinsic. I guess the extrinsic input is usually physical. It's something that you see or something that you hear. Sometimes something that you smell, like your body has 5 senses: touch, taste, smell, hearing, and sight. I guess, is that 5? I think I named them all. And
I think so.
Yeah. And most of those senses, the smell, the sight, the hearing, are connected, through synapses, I guess, to a part of your brain called the amygdala. And the amygdala works in concert with a part of your brain called the thalamus to constantly assess for threat. From an evolutionary standpoint, that's a really important thing because our prehistoric ancestors had a lot of threats in their physical environment that they either, when their brain recognized that threat, they went into fight or flight. They either had to fight the saber-toothed tiger or they had to run away from it as quickly as possible. And, so we're not facing saber-toothed tigers in 2018, literally, but there are, sometimes we are under physical danger. But there's a lot of mental danger, that we process, which can pretty quickly turn into an emotional response. But it's usually a conversation or an email or some other kind of input that is physical input, I guess, that's going to trigger that emotional or physical or mental response.
Yeah, I guess they can go together too. Like, if I have an emotional reaction to something, then maybe it makes me more inclined to impulsively check my email or distract myself from the task at hand.
Yeah, that's true. And I think the other thing to recognize is there are some neurochemicals that are in play. Like you take the email example. Most people, I've asked a lot of people this question, like how many emails or text messages do you get in a day? And the average answer is usually somewhere, for corporate people at least, usually somewhere between 200 and 300 a day. And most people at this point have been smart enough to turn off the audio notification of an incoming email, but their phone still usually vibrates in their pocket or on the table, or maybe the screen lights up from a notification when it comes in. And so, I asked them, what's your reaction to that? And a lot of people will literally kind of jump, they'll show me, their eyes will squint up, or there's some sort of emergency kind of response. Well, what's happening? There's a neurochemical that's being released every time you're aware that something new came in on your phone. The neurochemical is called dopamine. And dopamine is the main neurochemical that's involved in the addiction cycle. And so when you get addicted to alcohol or methamphetamine or opioids or whatever it is, some really serious things, obviously, dopamine is the reinforcing neurochemical that makes you want to come back to that thing that's bad for you. Now, dopamine's not always bad. It's like the pleasure neurochemical, and out of those 200 emails I get in a day, 195 of them are just crap. There's really not worth reading, but 4 or 5 of them might be actually really interesting. So that's enough interest, and engagement to give me a dopamine squirt. And I get a dopamine squirt, now 200 times or 300 times a day every time my phone lights up. Well, no wonder you're distracted, right? So it's just, there's a lot going on. I had an opportunity to talk with a neuroscientist the other day for a podcast that I'm producing, and he's a guy out of Stanford, and he's an expert actually on dopamine pathways and all this stuff. And I asked him, I said, how have you applied that stuff in your own life? And what you're an expert on the brain and how it works. He said, oh my gosh, I wish I could manage my email better. I hate myself because I'm not checking my phone. And I know what's going on. I know physically, neurochemically what's happening, and I still can't do it. So I try to set boundaries for myself, and there are phone-free zones and phone-free times in his day, where he doesn't have the physical opportunity to pick it up and look,
The deck is really stacked against us.
Yeah.
When, you have billion-dollar companies designing icons to click it. I don't know this for sure. I'm just speculating, but I would assume that even the sounds that the phones make to alert you have been tested and retested until they find the perfect sound to get your attention.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, there's nothing that comes out of Silicon Valley that isn't A/B tested until the cows come home, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So, even if you're an expert,
your option B, and we'll just keep iterating on that until we find the optimal answer.
Right. And we're dealing with the amygdala, a brain that's, not really equipped to handle that kind of bombardment. And, I'm not sure. We were talking about dopamine, and I'm fairly familiar with how dopamine works with the receptors and stuff like that. And I'm also curious to know that if dopamine's being released every time we get a buzz in the email, is that affecting our ability to produce dopamine farther down the road? Is there a point to where our brain says, you're producing too much, and then it cuts back on the receptors? Like a lot of times that happens with people who are addicted to drugs. Mm-hmm. I think like meth, for instance. With the first time that you do meth, you just get an avalanche of dopamine into your brain, and it's like that first high, and then your brain's like, whoa, like this is way too much. This is not right. Shuts off the receptors, and then over time, you never get to that high that you felt before, but over time it just, you slowly, you have to do it to feel normal.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not an expert, it sounds like you've done a lot of reading on this yourself. I'm not an expert on the process, but I think, the idea from addiction is you have to have more and more and more of whatever it is you're addicted to stay at the same level of, for lack of a better word, happiness. That's certainly not the right word, but, to stay at a level where, it keeps you coming back.
Yeah. I'd be interested to see the testing in like 20 or 30 years to all of these things that we're doing and we've implemented sort of in our daily life. So another thing that you talk about in your book is sleep, which is something that's huge in my life. It's a huge priority for me because I've had horrible sleep issues. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to hear about maybe your process for unwinding and the end of the day going to sleep.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm kind of like the neuroscientist at Stanford. I'm probably not as good. I'm not as consistently good at it as I'd like to be. I know what my best practices are, and sometimes I follow my best practices, and other times I don't. I think the thing really is to quit working. I found that in my own experience to not, there's so much work that we can do now because, there's so many devices available to do it on. You've got your phone in your pocket and you can check the email and respond to emails and whatever. But when I'm really at my best, I have quit work I don't do any work after dinner. I go for a walk with my wife, maybe after dinner. We maybe watch one of our favorite shows together. We've got shows that we follow. We're really into Billions right now. I love that show.
Mm-hmm.
That just started again. And The Americans is another one that we love. And so, we'll watch Billions or The Americans, or maybe we'll go out to dinner or whatever. And just kind of relax into the evening and start getting ready. We're old, so we start going to bed. Getting ready for bed about 9:45. And ideally, I've learned this one the hard way. Even when you have the nighttime screen on your phone, it still messes up your circadian rhythm. And if nothing else, it keeps your spouse awake. And, so I've really gotten out of the bad habit of reading in bed with my iPad or my phone. And, I was reading books on my Kindle. So I felt good about that. I'm actually reading books.
Yeah.
But the screen, the light and the screen and stuff is just not good. And even when you have the nighttime mode on, it's probably not good for yourself from a circadian rhythm standpoint. So, it's just kind of take the last couple of hours of the day off, relax, have some fun, have some nice conversation, maybe a glass of wine, or I'm a single malt Scotch fan, a nice glass of single malt Scotch, and, get ready for bed at a reasonable hour and go to bed,
Do you do any preparation for the following day at night or in the evenings?
I usually do my prep for the following day at the end of my work day, which is really nothing more than looking at my calendar. What that allows me to do, and I'm a big believer in this. I do this with writing too, because I write a blog, and I typically try to write once a week on the blog these days. And my best case scenario, I typically try to write on Mondays or Tuesdays for the blog in the mornings, because I do my best writing in the mornings, I've learned. And I typically try to write. I want to know before I go to bed at night what I'm going to write about that next morning, because my brain will definitely work on that while I'm asleep, and I'll wake up in the morning with some connections on the story or on the post that I maybe didn't have the night before, but my brain was working that, kind of in the background.
I think it's called the diffuse mode. The focus and the diffuse mode of the brain is sort of the background processes. That's really smart. And it's something that I try to do too. If I know I'm tackling something the next day, I'll read the question and not even really actively try to think of answers or solutions, but just know that I'm coming back to it the next day. And oftentimes, I have insights that I wouldn't have been able to have.
Yeah, I think it's the same thing with reviewing my calendar ahead of time too. Is if I have an important meeting coming up the next day or whatever, it's just I always ask my clients. One of the big things I do when I'm coaching clients is teach them basically a really simple, either self-coaching process, or it's a process that anybody can do with a peer, no matter how much or how little coach training they've had in their life. They could have zero coach training and do this effectively. And it's basically pick an event on the calendar that matters. Pick an event where you really need to show up at your best as a leader or a colleague or a parent or a spouse, or whatever the role is that you're playing in that meeting. And, get clear about what the event is. And then there's two questions. What am I trying to do in that meeting? What happens at the end if it goes really, really well? What do people know or think or do, or how do they feel? And then the second big question is, so how do I need to show up to help make that outcome happen? Do I need to show up with high energy, low energy, high positive energy, low positive energy? What are the words that would describe either one of those? Or actually, do I need to express some anger or some frustration and then transition into something that leads to a constructive outcome? It just could be anything, but visualizing, how do I need to show up in that particular conversation or meeting to make it likely to get to the outcome that I think I need to get to, or we as a group need to get to. And so if you can look at your calendar, for the next day, and you've got 10 meetings. They're not all going to be equally important, but maybe pick out a couple that you're either nervous about or you really need them to go well, and just kind of walk through that what and how set of questions briefly, when you're doing the next day review. And again, like you said, it's diffuse mode. Your brain kind of works in the background while you're sleeping on that. And it's just, I think it's a good preparatory move, and it's a good confidence building move.
Do you think it's, as far as the visualization process, I guess it's giving somebody a path to where they know they need to be, and then sort of figuring out the steps before the said meeting?
Yeah, I think, it's really not that many steps, right? I mean, that what am I trying to do and how do I need to show up to do that? I mean, I usually, when I'm giving a talk or leading a workshop that includes that content, I usually set up that segment with a few pictures of Olympians, Michael Phelps or Usain Bolt or Lindsey Vonn or whoever. I've had a chance to ask Olympic athletes and to verify that what and how visualization process is pretty much what they do. If it's Lindsey Vonn at the top of the mountain before the gate flies open, or it's Michael Phelps when he's on the block and he's kind of totally in a mental zone, right? Mm-hmm. And, they're working through that.
In your mornings, do you have any specific morning routines? And the more specific, the better. Like, do you have your morning outlined?
I don't have it outlined, but I've been doing it long enough that I know what it is. So these are mornings at home. I tend to travel a lot for business, so the routine changes when I'm, in a hotel room and need to get out the door by 7:30 or whatever it is, in East Coast time, when my body thinks it's 4:30 a.m. Pacific time. But when I'm at home in California, the routine is wake up. This may not be the world's, if I'm being completely honest, this may not be best practice, but I like to read through the New York Times headlines on my phone before I get out of bed, and maybe read an article or two. And I'm a news person. I've always been, since I was like 6 or 7 years old, somebody that wanted to be informed about what was going on in the world. And I just find that it may not sound relaxing to people, but I find it a relaxing way to kind of get my brain awake and just kind of engage my brain, before I get out of bed. And then the next thing is to go make some breakfast. A nice pot of tea is my preferred drink of choice, and that's kind of my little caffeine fix for the morning. And then it would be a 10 to 20 minute walk in the park across the street from where we live. And at the end of the first 10 minutes, there's a particular spot where I like to do about 5 minutes of yogic type stretching. It's a spot with a really lovely view. And then I'll walk back to our place, on the second 10 minutes. And if it's a really perfect morning, I'm going to go sit on a cushion that I have positioned in my closet, and I close the door and I meditate for 12 minutes. And there's a reason it's 12 minutes.
Yeah. Why 12?
Because there's research out of the University of California at San Francisco, led by Nobel Prize winner Elizabeth Blackburn, that as little as 12 minutes a day of meditative breathing increases an enzyme in your body called telomerase, which is the enzyme that helps protective caps on the ends of your chromosomes called telomeres stay long and healthy, which over the course of life, they shorten and degrade. So 12 minutes a day of meditative breathing can help your telomeres stay healthier. And I have multiple sclerosis, and there's a lot of things I do to sustain my health and well-being with multiple sclerosis. And when I learned about that research about how meditative breathing can improve your genetic expression, I got very, very serious about being consistent with meditation. I'd been a dabbler for years. I would do it for a few weeks or months and then stop for another few weeks or months. But once I heard that, I guess back in 2013 was when I heard that, and read more about it, I got really serious about making sure I did it every day.
And speaking of the multiple sclerosis diagnosis, you went from being a runner to a yogi.
Yeah.
Could you tell me about that transition, how it affects, the self-image that you had of yourself, considering that, you basically thought of yourself as a runner. It was something that you associated with you, and then you're not able to do that. So I have to imagine that that's a hard transition to overcome.
Yeah, it was super hard. So I'd been a runner since, I want to say 7th or 8th grade, so like when I was 13 or 14 years old, I was never really a good athlete as a kid, and I'm probably still not a good athlete, but running, I'm not a good athlete with anything involving a ball and a stick, that's for sure. But running was something that I could do, and I was never, a super fast runner, but I was somebody who could do a lot of distance, there was a classic book, I think it was called Running, by a guy named Jim Fixx back in the 70s. So I think it was when it came out. And that was kind of the runner's Bible back then, when the running movement really took off in the United States. And Jim Fixx wrote a lot about why you should keep going if you're a runner, and how to keep going. Like you're on a long run and you are really getting tired and you're fatigued and like, why am I, I'm going to quit. And you don't quit. Even if you can't remember why you started, there must have been a reason why you started. And you pick out a spot, 200 or 300 yards in a distance, like the telephone pole or the street sign or whatever, and you make yourself run to that street sign. And then when you get there, you pick out another spot 200 or 300 yards ahead, and you run to the next spot. And eventually you finish your run, Yeah. But the key phrase is you finish your run. And that is, I think, the mentality, at least for me, identifying myself as a runner, that was my mentality, right? It was like, no matter what, I'm going to finish this damn thing.
Right.
And that applied to anything that I did. And it's a very linear way, like literally, you're running along the line. It's a very linear way to live your life. And, it's A to B to C to D to E and so forth, and just complete. And when I was diagnosed with MS in this summer, really, I guess, of 2009, this was after 6 months of my legs feeling like lead. And I on my runs, and I thought, well, I've had times before where it's not felt so great. Let me get on WebMD and figure out what's wrong, like self-diagnose, like any good type A person.
Dr. Scott.
Yeah, Dr. Scott. And my self-diagnosis was a condition called lumbar stenosis, where I must have had like a pinched nerve in my spine. That was my conclusion. So I went to a physiatrist, which is a medical specialist who kind of deals with the intersection of nerves and bone structure and stuff. And I walked in. I said, I'm pretty sure I have lumbar stenosis. I just need you to tell me what to do to fix it. And she said, that's really interesting. Thanks for the diagnosis. I said, why don't we run some MRIs and let's see what's going on with you. And so the MRIs, we had them done. And in the intervening 2 or 3 weeks between having those done and going back to get the results, my condition got to be so bad I literally could not feel my feet on the ground. Like they were on the ground, but I couldn't feel them touch the ground, which makes it really hard to walk, let alone run.
Yeah.
And I was becoming more and more disabled, honestly. I couldn't walk around the block without my wife propping me up, and I had to pull myself up the stairs to get to the bedroom at night by the banister because my legs weren't really moving the way they should. And so I went back, and she said, you've got lesions on your spine here, here, and here, and you've got lesions in your brain. I'm pretty sure you have MS, and you need to go to a neurologist and get a spinal tap to have it confirmed, which we did. And there was protein in the spinal tap, which suggests that I have MS. And so the rest of that year and into 2010 was really rough, and my conditions got worse, and my mental acuity got really bad. There's a lot of cognitive issues with MS that occur. I was on some pretty heavy drugs that didn't agree with my liver and didn't agree with my brain. So as far as side effects go. And so by the fall of 2010, things were really bad. And a friend of my wife, who's a holistic health expert and multi-degreed in different disciplines, is also a yoga instructor. And she said to Diane that Scott should do yoga. She said, I use yoga with patients with Parkinson's and MS and other autoimmune, kind of neurological diseases, and I have really good outcomes with them. You should do yoga. And I said, that's like really interesting, but I can hardly stand up. So how am I going to do yoga? And Diane kept on me and in a loving way. And a couple of months later, I went to my first yoga class, which was like a heated yoga class, which maybe isn't the best way to start, but I did. And the teacher that first night, I whispered to her that I had MS. Don't tell anybody, because we weren't telling anybody, because my profession depends on me showing up and putting words together in a coherent fashion. And it was questionable which days I was going to be able to do that. There were good days and bad days. But the teacher said, it's okay. We have people like you pretty frequently. Here's the deal I'll make you. If you come here 3 days a week, it'll change your body. And if you come here more than 3 days a week, it'll change your life. And so I started going 4 or 5 days a week at that point. And the physical improvements happened pretty immediately, not like very first class, but within 2 or 3 months, I had a lot more range of motion, a lot more strength, and I was feeling better than I had. And then what happened over more time was emotionally, I was different. Mentally, I was different. And a lot of people, especially in the U.S., I guess, they see there's a lot of yoga, represented in commercials on TV or whatever. And it's usually people talking in kind of airy voices. And, they kind of make the stereotype of yoga is it's all about downward dog and, tree pose and whatever. But there's way more to it than just the pose. The practice of yoga historically, going back 3,000 or 4,000 years, they call it the 8 limbs of yoga. And the first 2 of the 8 limbs are really basically rules for living. The third limb is called the asana in Sanskrit, and that's the actual pose, the physical pose. But the asana is really just to get you ready for the fourth limb, which is pranayama, which is breathing, which is, prana in Sanskrit is the word for life force. Pranayama is, the practice of moving your life force via your breath throughout your body. And then that sets you up for subsequent limbs of yoga, like concentration, withdrawal of your senses, meditation. And then finally, the last limb is in Sanskrit called samadhi, which is, a state that I don't think I've reached, but that's the goal, and it's a state of oneness or a feeling of oneness with the life source. However you think about that, whether there is a life source, whether there's a God, or whether there's some force in the universe that started everything or connects us. However you think about it, samadhi is connection one with that force. And yoga, so with all that is not a linear process. It's a very integrative process. And so the difference it's a long answer to a short question. The difference between being a runner and being a yogi is linear versus integrated. And judging versus non-judging is a very big one too, because as a runner, I judged the hell out of myself. That was either a good run or a bad run or whatever. One of my favorite yoga teachers ever used to have this one-liner she'd always use. She's like, oh my gosh, you guys look so serious. Come on, it's just a freaking yoga pose. And then it's like the other cliche, yoga teacher cliche, is it's not yoga perfect, it's yoga practice. And, that's that mindset that this is just one class, or this is just one experience that I'm having with yoga. It is not a verdict on my entire life or my fitness as a human being. It's just like I'm either having a good day or not so good day, and it's all good because tomorrow's going to be different. Actually, in a 90-minute class, the second half of the 90-minute class is going to be different. Who knows? Don't know. That's cool. That's great. Live with it.
So, whereas I think a lot of people think of it as, just an exercise, it's just a whole lifestyle change.
Well, it's a system. I think it's a system for living, and I don't want to oversell it. I mean, it can be that if you want it to be. It's also just really good exercise, and I'm not saying that I have friends who do, and I don't know enough to do it, but I don't do chants in Sanskrit for very long. I mean, like I can say namaste and I can say samadhi and some other things, but
do you incorporate the breathing exercises regularly?
Yeah, I mean, in a good yoga class, a really a qualified yoga teacher is really going to emphasize the breath, and the inhalation and the exhalation should be in synchronicity with where you are in the pose and the transitions between the poses and things like that. So, yeah, breath is key in yoga, and you really can't do the poses well if you're not breathing effectively. The style of breathing that is usually called for in yoga is called ujjayi breathing, and it's a breathe in through the nose, and kind of like if you're doing it right, you sound like Darth Vader. It's like I don't know if you can hear me or not, but it's like in English it's called Darth Vader breathing.
Darth Vader breathing.
Yes, good.
I've been practicing yoga some with my wife. And I'll tell you, I'm somebody who, I mean, I guess, like I said earlier, my occupation has been a competition. I'm a competitive person. It is really hard to not be able to do some of the poses and not take it very seriously, and not compete, for me especially. So that's something that I need to work on. I'm a constant work in progress, as I think most people probably are. I do want to go back real quick to the MS diagnosis, because when I was reading your book and I read that, I just kind of put myself in that situation, and I was wondering. So obviously, it's very hard for you, but your partner as well. It has to be one of those situations where your partner's reaction can really make or break everything. I guess I was just wondering how she helped you through and continually lifted you up.
Well, that's like a 10-hour conversation.
Yeah, that we have about 7 minutes for.
Yeah, but she was and is amazing. I mean, in the traditional marriage vows, it's for better, for worse, in sickness and in health. And she lives her vows, and I try to for her as well when she has a challenge. What's the best place to start? I mean, first is she stuck by me, and she loved me no matter what. And the no matter what was a pretty big no matter what, because it wasn't just the physical aspects of it or the fact that I would forget to close the garage door because my brain was so foggy, and our collie would run out the garage and be lost somewhere in the neighborhood for the 15th time this week, and just there were so many, just dumb things that I did because I wasn't thinking clearly that she didn't freak out about and forgave. She made my wife is an amazing chef and cook, and she made sure that I got a lot of good food. She actually enrolled in the Institute for Integrative Nutrition because our son was sick at the same time with chronic Lyme disease, and diet was a big issue for him as well. And so she made sure that we ate really healthy food, that could heal our bodies, which in the end it helped do. She was a huge source of moral support, listening, hugging me, and loving me, and letting me know that I was still me and still okay. And when you're on some of these drugs, I mean, one of the side effects for me, at least, was one particular drug made me incredibly irritable. I was a son of a bitch to live with when I was taking that drug. And she didn't take it personally. She knew that it was a side effect of the drug and it wasn't really me. And I mean, like I said, I could go on and on and on, but that's just like my top of mind first 10 things that she did.
That's incredible. And most of the time when you make your wedding vows, you are healthy. And
yeah, that's true.
It's hard to
you don't know how you're going to deal with the situation until the situation happens. So to have a partner that, lifted you up and helped you through, I think, it's an amazing blessing in life. And it's probably the reason why you're here today.
No, there's no doubt about it. There is no doubt about that, what you just said. It's pretty interesting to me. Most of us get married. If we get married sometime in our 20s, maybe, or early 30s. We got married when we were married. I think I was 26 and Diane was 23. And both of my kids are older than we were when we got married. And my kids are really smart guys and really great human beings and adults, but I can still see them learning stuff, and I hope I'm still learning stuff too. But if you think about it, when you're 26 to 23 and you get married, you really don't know enough. I don't think I knew enough in life to say, well, I'm going to pick this person to be my life partner for the next 40 or 50 or 60 years.
Oh my God. No.
It's like, I just feel like you can say blessed or lucky or all of the above, that when you pick a partner at that age and that stage in your life, and 30 plus years later, in our case, we still love each other madly. And, not every day is a day in paradise for whatever reason, but, we're there for each other. It's really amazing.
Yeah. I grew up in the Southeast, Tennessee, and it's the Bible Belt, and people get married young. Like my grandparents were married when they were 19 years old.
Right.
I think
you're still a kid. Yeah.
I think about the decisions I made when I was 19. Like I wasn't qualified for anything. I wasn't qualified to make any decision, any life decision, much less choosing a partner to spend forever with,
Yeah.
And even in my early 20s is no dice. Now I hope, I hope my wife is chosen well, with me. But I mean, the person that I was 10 years ago is not the person I am today. And I'm going to venture a guess that the person I am 10 years from now is not going to be the person that I am today. So keeping that relationship healthy it's tough.
Yeah.
And you need an element of luck. Yeah, for sure. For sure it does.
I would say luck. And then if you're lucky enough to choose somebody that has a lot of potential, once you've chosen somebody with a lot of potential, then it's hard. It's just doing the work, and that's a conversation we could have about what's the work of a strong marriage. But
and you don't interfere. You don't create any interference for them. You help them realize their potential.
Yeah.
So throughout the course of your life, have you ever staunchly believed something only to reverse course later on? And if so, what led to that change of belief?
Wow, that's a big question to end on. So there's been a lot of beliefs that I've had that have changed over time. I haven't really articulated this before. I don't think I've articulated it out loud. So this will be kind of rough and in draft form, but
that's fine.
We talked earlier about the MS experience. I've learned so much about myself from having MS, and I'm very fortunate with the MS because I'm able to do everything I want to do in my life, and I'm not in a wheelchair. And I know a lot of people that have MS end up in a wheelchair, and maybe I will do too someday. But it's going on 10 years now since I was diagnosed, and I am stronger and have more range of motion and flexibility than I did when I was diagnosed. And my MRIs are stable and no new lesions and all that. So, and that's really a lot of it is because I think all of it, I'm not on any drugs at the moment, haven't been for years. And I think a lot of why that's the case is what I do from a routine standpoint to stay healthy. And so I guess I always believe that, input equals output. That's not like a new belief, there or cause and effect or karma. There's different ways to explain that idea. But I guess one of the biggest things I've learned from MS is that people care. And I knew they cared, but I kind of always held myself off at a distance a little bit. I didn't really want to get too personal in conversations. And when I was writing that book that you mentioned, Overworked and Overwhelmed, I couldn't have written that book if I had not been through the experience that I'd been through with MS. I mean, I wouldn't have gotten into the yoga in the way that I did, and I wouldn't have learned about stress management like I did, and I wouldn't have made the connections I did back to my work with my clients in corporate land and all of that. And so I had to make a decision that I was going to go public with the MS, because that book would not have been an authentic book if I hadn't done that, and if I hadn't written about that experience in the book. And I do a lot of public speaking, and I have for years, based on my first book and then on the second book, and now kind of on both books combined and other things. And up until the first few speeches I gave after the new book came out, I was always talking about the model, there's this model of leadership, or there's this technique you can apply to be a better leader. And it was always kind of at a remove. I wasn't going to put myself in the middle of that. I was just like, here's the model. And I got good responses, and people seemed to appreciate the content and the work, but it wasn't like an emotional connection. And one of the first keynotes I gave about the new book, I told one of the first times in public, I told my own story with the MS and how I have managed it and came back from it and so forth. And I got a standing ovation at the end of that keynote. And that's not something that happened all the time, right? Mm-hmm. And it was like, wow, what just happened? And it was this shift from talking about the model to talking about myself. And it's kind of what the point you made prior to us recording. People relate to stories, and they relate the most, if it's a true story, I think, to your own story, and they see themselves in your story. And I every time I talk about my journey with MS and the lessons I've learned from that and how it applies to self-management and leadership and whatever else, I always, without fail, practically have people coming up to me on the break or after the speech, I have MS, or my spouse has MS, or I have a child or a friend who has MS or Parkinson's or whatever. Can you tell me more about what you've done? I really want to help them. And it's just like that level of connection that comes from being open about what you're dealing with is like, I always tried to avoid that. And I believed that wasn't really the right way to go. Just like it was too much information. It was too personal and so forth. And
you allowed yourself to be vulnerable.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. That, and it's just human connection. We both probably like podcasts, or we wouldn't be having this conversation. And Chris Hardwick, right now on his podcast, has a wonderful interview with Alan Alda, the actor, that's best known from MASH, and an hour and 40-minute conversation. And about half of that is Alan Alda talking about improv and how improv changed his life, how he's using it with scientists to help them explain to the lay people their scientific findings in ways that lay people can understand and appreciate and support. And Alan Alda was talking about, it's all about relation. It's all about relating to others. And I thought, wow, that's kind of, he just said it in different words, and I'll go with his words because he's way cooler than me. And just, just has I just find him a wonderful, wise person. I've heard him interviewed several times, and with that relational connection, that's it. That's what makes this human, and that's what makes life at some level worth living, is the quality of our connection. And so I'm really happy, and I'm really grateful that I had that lesson taught to me by circumstance, by, go back to the beginning of the conversation, by the extrinsic interference of MS, right? Mm-hmm. And I can say intrinsically, wow, this really sucks that I have MS. Or I can say, well, okay, what am I learning from this?
How am I growing? And I mean, that's a great answer, and a great spot to end the show. Allow yourself to be vulnerable. People will, I guess the fear is that people are going to crush you, or that you'll be embarrassed, or that people won't care. But I think that when you do allow yourself to be vulnerable and put yourself out there, people do care more than we think they do.
Oh, yeah. And that's been a big, huge lesson for me. And I think what you just said is completely true. So,
Scott,
Brad, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. This has been great.
It's my pleasure. And one last thing, if somebody wants to find you on the internet, where can they find you?
Yeah, sure. So our website is eblingroup.com. It's E, B as in boy, L-I-N as in Nancy, and the word group, all one thing, and the URL, eblingroup.com, or just Google me, Scott Eblin, and there's a bunch of stuff online that I've written or videos I've recorded or whatever. You can follow me on Instagram at Scott Eblin. I'd love for you to do that. I'm trying to get more folks to follow me on Instagram and Twitter. I've been on Twitter for a long time. So Scott Eblin on Twitter. So just lots of different places.
Awesome, Scott. Thanks for taking the time to be on the show.
My pleasure, Brad. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome.